We had human parents to discipline us, and we respected them. Should we not be even more willing to be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time as seemed best to them, but he disciplines us for our good, in order that we may share his holiness. Now discipline always seems painful rather than pleasant at the time, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness for those who have been trained by it. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 9 through 11. This is a 1999 Chevy Astro van, and I have recently replaced this Hydro Boost unit, which provides brake assist and also power steering assist. And there are other videos that show how to replace it. What started this project was my wife lost all power steering and power brakes all of a sudden after hearing a noise. And so she was stranded in a parking lot. Fortunately, it wasn't out on the road when that happened. She had the car running for because it was cold outside, and to keep heat while she waited for my son to get there. And so meanwhile, all of the fluid dumped out of the power steering system and the Hydro Boost system. So this is what the original Hydro Boost system looked like. The master cylinder connects right here, and this is the accumulator. And when I opened the hood first, it was kind of cocked over this way, and it was partially in, partially out, but you can see that there was an opening there, and that opening allowed all of the power steering fluid to be pumped out of the system into the engine compartment. So I got a really pretty good leak coming from the back of my power steering pump, so looks like I'm gonna have to go ahead and replace that. Okay, to get this fan off, I just stuck a screwdriver down on between the bolts on the front of the water pump pulley there, and then I have this 1.5 inch crescent wrench on there, and I just pushed in opposite directions those two things, and it took a little bit to break it free, but it wasn't too bad. Okay, I borrowed a pulley puller from O'Reilly's. I'm just able to do this without an impact. I got a 16 millimeter on a breaker bar there, and then I've got a 13/16 open end wrench resting it on the bottom of the water pump pulley there, and it's really not coming off too hard at all, so just takes a while to do it this way. Okay, that's switched to the ratchet now, and it seems to be coming off really easily. Okay, and there we are. Pulley is off. And there you can see the pulley thing. It's got this little sleeve. Comes off. And these two clamshell devices. So one side has a smaller diameter, and that's the part that fits in the pulley groove, and then the other part fits right in there like that. So when you start, you kind of snug it up, and you put the other side on same way. And you just slide that little sleeve over it. Okay, there are 3 bolts on the front holding this on. 1, 2, 3, and then there's one on the back. Okay, so I have that pump partially out of there. I'm going to go ahead and take the hose off from the remote reservoir right there. Hose goes back down around there and right there. So I've already drained out the fluid, so that won't make a mess when I take that off. Okay, so I had taken the return line off, which is the rubber hose that has a hose clamp on it that's on the other side. There's a small, it's a 3/8 inch hose that goes up, and there's a hose clamp on it, so you can take that off. And so, but I still have the feed line that goes up to the Hydro Boost unit, and that's still connected, and I was still able to finagle that thing so it would come out of there like that. So okay, so looking at the pump that I took out, it's pretty darn oily all over the place, so kind of hard to tell exactly where the leak was coming from at this point. There's a fair amount of oil pooled up in here, so it may have been coming from that hose right there. Also, the body of this the pump is pretty rusted. Could have been coming from this connection here, but all that is blind to you. And this is the return line that I was talking about. There's a 3/8 hose that goes from here all the way up to an oil cooler tube that sits underneath the radiator area, and you don't have to take the radiator out to get to it. It's just it routes underneath the radiator and pokes out in the front, and there's just a long pipe. It's kind of the same size pipe, but it just runs. It's not a heat exchanger or anything. It's just a pipe that runs. Okay, so you're looking now at that cooler pipe I was talking about in that bright end. So this is the high pressure line going to the steering gear, and this is coming from the pump, going to the pump rather. It's the return line, and so this it's just a big tube that goes all the way over here, and that's just to provide some cooling for the power steering. And then there was just this little metal clamp that I cut off there and just replace that with a hose clamp. And this other hose just goes, right up. It's only, about a foot long hose, and it goes right to the steering gear. So if you're if you're into it this far, it's not a terribly big deal to get to that. Okay, so I want to get a good visual of this before I take the bracket off, so I know I'm putting it on right. So this is the nut that was still tight. It's right underneath or in closer proximity to the feed line, or the output of the pump. As far as which side goes on, this has got the curve on it, so I'll get that hose in the right place. But I wanted to get the orientation of this bracket proper. Here's the remanufactured pump, and according to my old diagram, this thing should go on like that, and the new hose would connect right there. But obviously I don't have a bolt here, so I'm assuming I have to take that off of the old one. So I'm gonna go do that. I noticed that the mounting studs are different. Actually, the one that's on here looks different than this one. It looks similar to this one. So I think I'm going to have to take this one off, that one off, and that one off. So in order to do this, I put this in the vise, and you can see that this casting has a couple of nice flat spots on it so that you can grab it there, and hopefully that'll give me enough leverage to get this stud out.
and they're pretty tight. Okay, I was finally able to get that loose. I had to use breaker bar and put it on there. My vise is a little small. If I had a bigger vise, it wouldn't have been bad, but I was able to get it. Okay, so I was able to get this one loose, 17 millimeter. There's plenty of oil in there. So I'm just going to leave that there until I'm able to get this other one out. Okay, so I was able to get both of these guys loose on the old one. So just with my ratchet and the vise holding it. So this one goes in here. I'm just going to go ahead and snug this up. Okay, so it took two people to locate that one, those power steering pump. One person under the vehicle kind of helping to line it up, and then the other person overhead putting in the bolts. And I did find out that the bolt in the rear was supposed to be through that bracket. When I took it out before, what I thought it was taken out, it was just one of the bolts holding on the bracket, but the bolt wasn't connected. The bolt wasn't even there, and this is an all-wheel drive van. So, and the problem is that the front forward gearbox is right underneath where you need to put that bolt in, and it wasn't lining up properly, and I don't think I could have got my hand back in there to put the bolt in anyway. So probably not ideal, but it's been running that way for a couple of years at least, because I don't know whether the bolt was there originally, but when we had the engine replaced, it didn't come back with it hooked up. So I don't know. I don't think it's possible really to see that very well back in there, but that's the general area of the bracket. It's kind of through that loop in the output line. So that's where that metal bracket is. You can kind of see it there. But it is not really flush with that place on the block where it's supposed to bolt up to. And like I said, it's really, really tight in there. I'm not sure how I could get my hand in there. And the torque specification on those three bolts is 37 foot-pounds. Okay, so I hooked up the new return line right here to the metal heat exchanger here, and then I ended up, because that thing's really tight up against the bottom of the radiator support, and so I ended up putting the hose on this side and then just pushing it back through because I couldn't get it through the other way. I also decided to replace this remote reservoir because it was all rusty and it was, kind of covered with oil, so I couldn't see where or if it was leaking, and so I replaced that. I replaced the hose that goes from that down to the pump, and I've just shown you how I replaced the power steering pump because, when I had put everything back together with the new Hydro Boost, I was still getting a leak, and it seemed like it was coming from the pump, especially when I put fluid in it, and I couldn't tell whether it was the pump or the hoses or whatnot, so I just replaced both the return hose that goes to the cooler line in the front of the vehicle, and also the power output from the pump that goes up to up to this port on the Hydro Boost, which is on the passenger side. Okay, so I've got a little bit of a problem with the routing here. I've got the output line from the pump positioned on the Hydro Boost unit, and it's running down. And you can see it's right on the steering knuckle. So that's not good, obviously. So I'm going to try to loosen the fitting on the back of the pump and see if I can't maybe move that, reposition that slightly. Otherwise, I'm just going to have to use some kind of a tie and bend that rubber hose in an unnatural way. So, okay, so here is the routing that I came up with. So the main thing was that cable, or that tie wrap there, and I tied it to the other hose. That way I miss the steering knuckle substantially. There's a little bit of room between that and that frame member, and so I mean, they may have to worry about a little body roll, but everything should be flexible enough. And so these are my homemade bent brake lines right here, and so there's no pressure on those either. So not perfect, but hopefully won't have any issues with it. Okay, this is the procedure for putting the pulley back on. There is a threaded portion of the pulley. It's down in a little ways. I first got confused because I looked at the end of it and there's no threads, but further back in there's threads, and so you just turn this guy like so. I've got that other wrench propped on that handy dandy frame member there, and it just kind of slowly squeezes it on. And you keep going until the wrench stops, and it won't go on anymore. It's because your pulley is in there, and then you just unscrew this. And voila, your pulley is flush with the shaft. Okay, so we're starting over the generator. Then underneath that idler pulley, over the top of the air conditioning compressor, around the power steering pump, up over the fan, and then down around the flywheel, and then up from the flywheel to the belt tensioner, which runs on the outside, and then back over the top of the generator again.